I'm writing this down because I need somebody else to know what happened, not because I expect to be believed. I stopped needing that a while ago. But I'm 31 years old, and I already have the kind of insomnia that makes my eyes feel like 2 old cigarette burns by 7 in the morning. And the doctor says it's anxiety, and I say it's memory, and neither of us is entirely wrong. The job came to me in late October through a woman named Petra, who worked the reference desk at the public library where I'd been spending most of my Tuesday afternoons. I was between teaching jobs, 4 months out, not desperate, but doing those small embarrassing calculations at the grocery store where you stand in front of the cheese for 4 minutes and put it back. Petra knew the way librarians know things without being told. She'd probably watched me return books half-read for months. One Tuesday, she slid a folded piece of paper across the desk to me without preamble. It had a name, Aldrich Voss, a phone number, and below that in her small, precise handwriting, house sitting. Good pay. Odd man, but harmless. 6 weeks. He's one of our donors, she said. Very private. He needs someone trustworthy to look after his property while he's abroad. I thought of you. I asked why me. She pushed her glasses up and said, with complete seriousness, because you always return the books on time, and you never dog-ear the pages. That was apparently the whole criteria. I called the number that evening. The phone rang 7 times before someone picked up, an actual person, which surprised me. People don't answer after 7 rings anymore. Yes? The voice was unhurried and slightly accented in a way I couldn't place. European, maybe, but from where specifically I couldn't say. It was a measured voice, the kind that had learned long ago that silence was not uncomfortable. I explained who I was and how I'd gotten his number. There was a pause of several seconds, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Petra's recommendation, he finally said. That's sufficient. Can you come to the house on Friday? I'll be leaving Sunday, so I'll need to show you everything before I go. I said yes before I even asked about the pay. The house was about 40 minutes outside the city, which I hadn't expected. I drove out there that Friday in my old Honda, following the GPS down a county road that eventually narrowed to a single lane running through a dense corridor of pine trees. The morning had been gray, and the afternoon was grayer, that particular November gray that isn't dramatic, just settled, like the sky has given up on doing anything else today. The property announced itself with a mailbox, plain, black numbers on it, nothing remarkable, and then a gravel driveway that curved through trees long enough that I couldn't see the house from the road. When I finally came around the last bend, I stopped the car for a moment and just sat there with the engine running. It was not what I expected, though I'm not sure what I had expected. Something Victorian and imposing, maybe, given everything else about the situation. Instead, it was a house from the 1940s, I guessed. 1.5 stories, wide porch across the front, painted white that had faded to a kind of bone color. Large windows, dark inside. A garden that had been well kept at some point but was now in that particular in-between state. Not wild, not tidy, just resting. The kind of garden that looks like it's waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. There was a car already in the driveway, a dark green Volvo that was at least 20 years old and impeccably maintained. So he was home. He opened the door before I knocked, which startled me more than it should have. Aldrich Voss was somewhere in his late 60s, though he carried it in the particular way that certain men do. Not young-looking, but structured, deliberate. He was tall with a narrow face and pale gray eyes that moved in the careful way of someone who has learned to watch things without appearing to. He wore a gray wool cardigan over a white shirt, dark trousers, and the kind of indoor shoes, soft-soled leather, that you almost never see in America. His hair was white and cut short. He was clean-shaved and had a very slight tremor in his right hand that he didn't try to hide. He looked at me for a moment, said nothing, and then stepped aside to let me in. The interior was warm. That was the first thing I noticed. Not temperature. Though it was heated, a radiator somewhere making its low ticking sound, but warm in the sense that the rooms were full of things. Books, mostly, on shelves that lined almost every wall in the front room. A wide couch with a worn-out velvet cushion that had probably been green once. A writing desk by the window, papers on it weighted down with a smooth stone. A fireplace that had been used recently. I could smell the ash. There were no photographs anywhere. Not on the walls, not on the mantelpiece, not on the desk. I noticed that early, and I kept noticing it throughout the tour. Everywhere there would naturally be photographs. In most people's houses, you can't turn around without running into someone's vacation or family reunion. There was just empty wall or a painting of a landscape or nothing at all. He made tea without asking if I wanted any, and we sat at the kitchen table, round, wooden, scarred with decades of use, while he told me what the job was. "I'll be gone for 6 weeks," he said. "Possibly slightly longer. I'll call once a week. I have a small collection here, books, and a few other items that I want someone on the property to look after. The house also has a temperamental heating system, an old oil furnace, and I'd rather not come home to frozen pipes. There is a handyman, his name is Carell, who you can call if anything mechanical goes wrong. His number is on the refrigerator." The pay was $1,500 per month, which came out to about $2,250 for the 6 weeks, which was more than I'd expected and more than I needed to pretend I had to think about it. I kept my face neutral and said that sounded reasonable. "You can use the car," he said, nodding toward the Volvo outside. "The Honda you drove in doesn't look like it would enjoy the winters out here." I said that was kind. "It's practical," he said without warmth or coldness, just as a statement of fact. He gave me the full tour after that. The house was bigger than it looked from outside. First floor, the main room with the books, the kitchen, a small half-bathroom, and a room at the back he referred to as the study, which had a locked door and which he did not offer to show me. Second floor, 2 bedrooms and a full bathroom. Basement, the furnace, a laundry room, and what he called simply storage. He did not show me the basement. "The basement door is in the kitchen," he said, "the one with the padlock. You don't need to go down there. Carell has a key if there's ever a furnace issue." I nodded. "The study is also locked. You don't need to go in there either." I nodded again. The tour took about 20 minutes. Then we went back to the kitchen and he refilled the tea. Mine was still mostly full, but he refilled it anyway, and he placed on the table between us a single sheet of paper. Handwritten, in a small, meticulous script that was neither old-fashioned nor modern, just careful. The writing of someone who wrote by hand regularly, who considered the act of writing an extension of thought rather than its mere transcription. 7 rules, he said. I'd like you to read them now in front of me in case you have questions. He let me take the paper with me when I left. In the weeks that followed, I read those rules many times. Not to memorize them, but they became memorized anyway, the way anything does when you return to it with enough regularity and enough attention. By the end of the first week, they had become a kind of interior checklist. By the end of the second week, they felt less like rules than like a description of the house's character. By the 5th week, when I broke one of them, I understood exactly what I was doing. That understanding didn't stop me. That's its own kind of fact about human nature that I'll leave for someone else to draw conclusions from. I have thought about the moment I read those 7 rules more times than I can count, and I have tried, in the way that you do when you're reconstructing something that has become important in retrospect, to remember exactly what I felt reading them at that kitchen table. Not what I think I should have felt, but what I actually felt. The honest answer is, not much. Not right away. The first 5 rules produced a kind of mental shrug, the recognition of a specific personality type. The person who knows something you don't, and has encoded that knowledge into rules rather than explanations, because the explanation would take longer than the rule and be less reliable. I had known teachers like this. Coaches. I had been this person, probably, at various points in my teaching career. Giving students protocols without the full underlying reasoning, because the reasoning was too long and they would forget it anyway, but the protocol they'd remember. Rules 6 and 7 were different, not because they were more alarming in their explicit content. Rule 6 is straightforwardly strange, but it's stranger in the abstract than it was in the moment of reading, sitting in a warm kitchen with a cup of tea going cold beside me. Rule 7 was the one that did something to the temperature in my chest. Not fear exactly, something more considered than fear. The recognition that this was a person who had experienced whatever Rule 7 described, who had lived in the same house through at least one new moon night without following it, or through many with it, and had arrived at these specific instructions. Whatever you think you see at the foot of the bed, keep your eyes closed. That specificity. The foot of the bed. I set the paper down. Aldrich looked at me. I had questions. I asked 3 of them. Rule 1. Do not open the windows on the north side of the house after dark. You may open them during the day, but close and latch them before sunset, every night without exception. Rule 2. The radio in the main room receives only one station clearly. You are welcome to use it. But if at any point the voice on the radio sounds familiar to you, as in you believe you recognize it as someone you know personally, turn it off immediately and do not turn it on again that night. Rule 3. On Tuesday nights, leave a glass of water on the kitchen table before you go to bed. Not a full glass. About halfway. Place it in the center of the table. In the morning, it will likely be empty. Do not worry about this. Do not try to stay awake to see what happens to it. Rule 4. The cat comes and goes through a small door I've installed beside the back door. Her name is Marte. Feed her twice a day. If, on any morning you cannot find her and she does not come when called, go about your day as normal. She will return by evening. If she is not returned by the following morning, call me immediately. Not Carell, me. Rule 5. There is a man who walks the road in front of the house most evenings, between 7 and 8 p.m. He is elderly, walks slowly, sometimes stops and looks at the house. Do not go outside while he is there. You may watch from the window, but do not open the door. Do not wave. He has never come onto the property and will not, provided you don't invite any kind of exchange. Rule 6. If you hear knocking on the basement door from below, from inside the basement, that is, not someone knocking from the kitchen side, do not open the padlock. Do not call Carell. Call me, day or night. Do not go near the door until I've called you back. Rule 7. On the night of the new moon, you will find the house feels different. Sounds carry in ways they don't on other nights. Shapes in the peripheral can seem to move. This is not unusual for the property. Take a mild sedative if you have one. Go to bed early and sleep through it. Whatever you hear, do not get up and investigate. Whatever you think you see in the hallway or at the foot of the bed, keep your eyes closed and breathe. By morning, everything will be as it was. I had questions. I asked 3 of them. The knocking from the basement. Has it happened before? Yes, he said. What's in the basement? He was quiet for a moment. Storage, he said again, in the same tone as before. Flat. Not defensive, not evasive, just the same word. As if saying it again was the whole answer. The last rule. The new moon. Has someone seen something, a previous house sitter? He looked at me steadily. There have been 2 previous house sitters, he said. The first was a nephew of mine who lasted 1 week and then left without explanation, and has not spoken to me since. The second was a woman who stayed the full duration. She was a retired schoolteacher. Extremely sensible woman. She left a note on the kitchen table when she was done, and the note said, "Everything was fine. I followed the rules. Do the same." He folded his hands on the table. "That's the fullest endorsement I can offer you," he said. I thought about it. I looked at the 7 rules again, and then I said I'd take the job. He left Sunday morning. I watched the dark green Volvo disappear down the gravel driveway from the front porch, and when the sound of the engine was completely gone, the quiet of the property settled around me like something physical. Not unpleasant, just very, very complete. I stood on the porch for another minute after the car was gone. The cold air smelled of pine and frozen soil, the particular clean emptiness of a winter morning before anything had moved through it. The garden was a pale beige tangle of dead stems, everything that had grown in the warmer months reduced to its skeletal minimum, still legible as plant life but barely. A bird was making noise somewhere in the trees along the driveway. I couldn't see it. I went inside and stood in the main room for a moment, taking inventory in the way you do when you're newly alone in a new space. The sounds were different when Aldrich was not there. Not louder or quieter, just differently arranged. When another person is in a building, even if you can't hear them specifically, the building feels different. The air has a subtle orientation. Without them, the air reorganizes itself, and everything reverts to a quality that is more purely spatial, more about the rooms themselves, the walls, and the volumes they contain. I had lived alone for 4 years and was not unfamiliar with this reorganization. But this was not my space, and that made it different. It was Aldrich's space, with all of Aldrich's arrangements. The particular placement of the reading lamp, the way the couch faced slightly away from the fireplace in a way that would bother some people, and which I suspected was deliberate, chosen for a reason I didn't yet know, maybe because that angle gave you the window on the side rather than straight on, maybe because from that angle you could see both the door and the hallway at once. These arrangements belonged to a life I didn't know. I was only borrowing the space. I was the water filling a container it hadn't shaped. I put the kettle on. I stood at the kitchen window again. The crow was back in the garden. Or a crow. I had no way of knowing if it was the same crow, though I had already started thinking of it as the same crow, which is what we do. We assign continuity to the things we can't track. The crow was at the base of the stone wall, doing something specific with something specific. I watched it and felt, for the first time in 4 months, not lonely. Not lonely in the way of being surrounded by people, but not lonely in the older, quieter sense. Occupied, present, sufficient. I didn't know then that this was how the house worked on some people. That it filled in around you in a particular way. That the particular quality of the quiet, which was not the silence of absence but the silence of density, of accumulated time, could be a kind of company for the right disposition. I only know that now. The first week was mostly fine. I should say that clearly, because it's easy when telling a story like this to skip past the fine parts and get to the strange ones. But the fine parts matter. The fine parts are what make the strange ones strange. If it had been terrifying from minute one, I would have left. Most people would. The reason we stay in situations we should leave is always, that it was fine for a while first. So, the first week was mostly fine. The house was comfortable. The radiator ticked in the evenings. I cooked actual meals for the first time in months, because there was a kitchen worth using and a pantry that Aldrich had stocked with basics before he left. I read 3 books from his shelves. He had an impressive collection of natural history, mostly, with pockets of very old philosophy and 1 shelf of crime novels that surprised me. I slept better than I had in my apartment. Marte the cat appeared on the second morning, through her little door, and sat on the kitchen floor watching me make coffee with an expression of flat evaluation, the way cats always look at new people. She was a medium-sized gray tabby, older with a notched left ear from some past altercation, and she had the self-contained dignity of a cat who has lived in interesting circumstances and is neither impressed nor alarmed by humans anymore. She ate the food I put out. She sometimes sat on the couch near me when I was reading, and she seemed to consider me acceptable, which was more than I'd expected. The man on the road appeared on the second evening, right when the rules said he would. 7 to 8, give or take. I watched him from the window of the main room. The lights low, so I didn't think he could see me clearly. He was old, genuinely old, the kind of old where the body has started making compromises. His back curved slightly, his steps small and deliberate. He wore a long coat, dark, and a hat with a brim. He carried nothing. He walked slowly past the house, which took a while given the size of the front garden. At one point he stopped, right at the property line where the gravel met the road, and turned his head toward the house. I watched him. He seemed to look at the windows for maybe 30 seconds, which is longer than 30 seconds feels when you're being looked at. Then he turned and continued walking, and eventually disappeared past the tree line down the road. I felt nothing particular watching him. He was just a man. He had a very particular quality of stillness. Even while walking, that was unusual. The way some very old people seem to have reached a place beyond hurry. I found myself wondering who he was, and why Aldrich had written a rule about him. He seemed harmless. He seemed like someone's grandfather on an evening walk. I reminded myself that the rules were the rules, and I hadn't been paid to interpret them. I moved away from the window. The first Tuesday, I left half a glass of water on the kitchen table before bed. I felt foolish doing it, which is probably a normal response. I lay in the upstairs bedroom and listened to the house settle, the ticking radiator, the occasional creak of what I assumed was a floorboard contracting in the cold, and eventually fell asleep. In the morning, the glass was empty. I stared at it for a while. I had not, as instructed, tried to stay awake. I had slept solidly. There was no other explanation that I tried very hard to come up with. It was possible that Marte had jumped up and knocked it over and lapped it off the table and I hadn't heard. It was possible I had sleepwalked and drunk it myself. It was possible I'd only thought I'd filled it halfway and actually it had been less, and it had just evaporated, which is physically implausible but which I still considered. I washed the glass. I didn't think about it too much. That's what the rule said, I didn't think about it too much. The radio I found on the third day, when the quiet of the house had become comfortable enough that I wanted something in the background while I read. It was a physical radio, old, with a dial, sitting on a shelf in the main room. Aldrich had been right. The reception was poor on most frequencies, mostly static, with half words floating in and out like people talking in the next room with the door half closed. But on one frequency, somewhere in the low AM range, there was a station that came in clearly. A man's voice, reading. That was all it was. Someone reading aloud, prose of some kind, in a calm and pleasant voice. No music, no advertisements, no call signs that I could make out. Just this man reading something in a low, steady voice. I listened for perhaps 20 minutes the first time. It was actually restful. I couldn't always follow the content. Whether it was a novel or something factual, I couldn't say. The language was formal and slightly strange, but the voice was good. The kind of reading voice that a thoughtful person develops over years, where you can hear the discipline behind the sound, the choices about pacing and breath. I turned it off when I went to make lunch and thought nothing particular of it. What I did notice over several listenings across the first 2 weeks was that the content of whatever was being read seemed to shift in ways I couldn't account for by normal broadcast logic. If it was a station and I had never found any station marker, no call sign, no interruption for advertising or station identification, then there should have been a schedule, a structure, some logic to what was read when. But every time I turned it on, the content was different. Not different in the way of chapters following chapters, but different in the way of completely unrelated material. Natural history, then what sounded like philosophical writing, then something that could have been instruction, then what sounded for a few minutes like someone's private letters read aloud. I thought about what Aldrich had told me about the house accumulating. Things following the same path downhill over and over until they carved a groove in the rock. I thought about a radio station that had no discernible origin broadcasting content that had no discernible pattern, in a house that had been occupied continuously since 1890. I thought about all the people who had sat in this main room over 130 years, reading, talking, arguing, crying, making the small and large sounds of human lives, and I thought about whatever was broadcasting from that one clear frequency, pulling what it pulled from wherever it pulled it. I'm not saying that's what the radio was doing. I'm saying the thought occurred to me in a way that felt more like recognition than speculation, and I set it aside and went to make dinner and didn't think too much about it. That's one of the things I learned in that house. When a thought feels more like recognition than speculation, the right response is to note it, set it aside, and go make dinner. The thinking can wait. The food can't. On the 5th day, I called Aldrich as he'd asked, once a week. He picked up on the 3rd ring this time. I told him everything was fine. He asked specifically about Marte, about the furnace, and about the water glass. I confirmed all 3. He said, "Good, you're doing well." And then he said, "The new moon is in 9 days." "I know," I said, because I had checked. "Sleep early," he said. "Don't read late. Don't give yourself reasons to be up past midnight." I said I understood. "How are you sleeping otherwise?" he asked. And there was something in the question that was not just small talk. A genuine check. "Better than I was at home," I said honestly. There was a small pause. "The house has that effect on some people," he said. "Others it troubles immediately. I find I can usually tell which way it will go by the end of the first week." Which way did I go? "The better way," he said. And then he said goodbye and hung up. Between the 1st and 2nd week, there was a Sunday that I want to describe, because it was the most purely pleasant day I spent in that house, and I've thought about it often since. The way you think about good things when what came after them turned out to be complicated. It had snowed overnight. Not much, maybe 2 inches, but enough to make the garden and the gravel and the pine trees along the driveway all go white and still, and I woke up to that particular light. The reflected snow light coming through the curtains before my alarm, which almost never happened. I lay in bed for a few minutes, just noticing that the house was quiet in a different way than usual. Not the ordinary nighttime quiet, the held breath of a building in darkness, but the daylight quiet of a world that had been briefly simplified. All the usual textures and variations covered over with one clean color. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window in my socks and the old sweater I'd brought from home, watching a fat crow work at something in the snow near the garden's stone wall. The crow had tremendous patience and also tremendous confidence, the way crows always do, as if they'd made a private assessment of the situation long ago and found everything sufficient. Marthe sat on the counter beside the coffee maker, which she was not supposed to do and which I allowed anyway because we were 6 days in, and she was still not letting me pet her, and I was operating on the theory that being permissive about the counter would eventually translate to goodwill in general. It was probably naive cat logic, but I didn't have better options. I spent most of that Sunday reading. I'd found a book in Aldrich's collection that turned out to be a first-hand account, written in the 1930s, of a naturalist's years living in the boreal forests of northern Canada. The man wrote with a plainness that I found deeply appealing. He described beaver dams and winter crossings and the particular silence of spruce forest under heavy snow with the same matter-of-fact attention he gave to everything else, including the physical discomfort, the loneliness, the small negotiations a person makes with themselves when they're alone in a large, quiet place for a long time. I recognized things in that book that I was starting to recognize in myself. The way solitude, past a certain threshold, stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like its own kind of presence. The way you begin to notice smaller things, the particular creak of a specific floorboard, the way the light in the main room changed over the course of an afternoon, moving from the east windows to the west ones and leaving the north side of the room in a consistent gray that was not unfriendly, just neutral, just the light doing what it does. By midday, the snow had started to melt off the pine branches, dropping in small sudden chunks onto the driveway below, and the crow was gone wherever crows go, and I had made soup from things I found in the pantry. Aldrich had good instincts about what to stock: dried lentils, canned tomatoes, a braid of garlic hanging by the door, and I ate at the kitchen table and felt something that I'd almost forgotten was possible. The uncomplicated sensation of being where you are, not partly somewhere else in your head, not planning or regretting or cataloging anxieties. Just in the chair, in the warm kitchen, with the soup. The afternoon I spent at the writing desk in the main room, writing letters. Not emails, actual letters, by hand, which I hadn't done since I was maybe 23. I wrote to my sister, who lived far enough away that we only talked twice a year out of a combination of mutual busyness and mutual love that had gone slightly rusty from disuse. I wrote 3 full pages to her about nothing specific: the snow, the crow, the book about the naturalist in the boreal forest. I wrote about Marthe with probably more detail than was necessary. I didn't mention anything about the 7 rules. I didn't know how to mention them without making the whole thing sound alarming. And nothing alarming had happened yet, and I didn't want to pre-alarm her for events that might not materialize. I stamped the envelope and left it on the entry table to post the next time I drove to town. And that night I went to bed early and slept without interruption, and when I think about that house, that Sunday is what I returned to first. The crow, the soup, the 3 pages to my sister, all the ordinary and sufficient things. The second week was when things started to accumulate. Not dramatically. That's not how these things work. Or at least, that's not how it worked in this case. It was more like the background noise of the place getting slightly louder, the way tinnitus works. You don't notice it increasing, because you're always only comparing it to the moment just before. You only notice when you try to remember what the silence sounded like at the beginning. The man on the road began stopping for longer. Not dramatically longer, but I had started watching him every evening. Partly out of habit, partly because it was something to do, partly because I had started to find him interesting in a way I didn't fully understand. And on Thursday of the second week, he stood at the property line for what I timed, on my phone, at 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Just stood there, facing the house, with his hands at his sides. Marthe did not seem to like this. On the evenings that the man was there, she would not sit near the window. She'd retreat to the center of the room or go upstairs. I noticed this and filed it somewhere. The radio, that second week, was when the first thing that I can only call actually strange happened. I was reading, Sunday afternoon, maybe 2 o'clock. The radio was on in the background, the usual station, the man reading. I wasn't paying close attention. It was just sound, company against the quiet. And then something shifted in the reading voice that made me look up from my book. The cadence had changed. It was still the same voice, the same measured tone, but where before it had been flowing in the way of prose, it had begun to sound more like a list. And then, while I was listening, trying to work out what was different, I heard my own name. Or I thought I did. It went by quickly, embedded in whatever the voice was reading. And the thing is, if you're listening to something with half your attention, and you hear your own name, your attention sharpens immediately. Your brain throws up a flag, but because it happens in that half-attentive state, you can never be entirely certain you actually heard it, because you were only half listening in the first place. This is the particular torture of that specific experience. I sat very still for a moment, staring at the radio. The voice continued. I listened hard for the next 2 minutes and heard nothing that sounded like my name again. I told myself, static resolving into syllables that happen to sound like something familiar. The brain is very good at pattern recognition, which means it's also very good at false pattern recognition. This is basic cognitive science. I taught high school science for 7 years. I know this, but I reached over and turned off the radio because the rules said to, if the voice sounded familiar. It didn't sound like someone I knew. It sounded like my own name coming from someone I didn't know. I wasn't entirely sure the rule applied, but I turned it off. I left it off for 2 days before I turned it back on, and when I did, it was ordinary again. The third week. The new moon was in 2 days, and I was, despite my best intentions, thinking about it. There is a particular kind of anticipatory anxiety that I have always been susceptible to, different from ordinary fear, which is at least immediate and reactive. Anticipatory anxiety lives in the gap between now and what might happen, and it feeds on imagination, which in my case had always been more active than was strictly useful. I had spent 6 years teaching teenagers biology and chemistry, which requires you to be specific and factual and leave imagination largely at the door. And I think that was good for me, those years. I think they trained something useful. But out here in the quiet of the house with too much reading time, imagination had started creeping back in through the edges. I tried to be methodical about it. Aldrich had told me to go to bed early and take a mild sedative and not read late. I had the sedatives. I had checked the new moon date 3 times on my phone as if verifying it would change something. I had mentally rehearsed the 7th rule so many times that it had started to lose its meaning, the way any phrase does if you repeat it too often, the words becoming just sounds. What I kept coming back to was Aldrich's nephew, 34 years old, standing in the bedroom in the dark, seeing his dead mother as she had looked when he was small, before she was sick, and not being able to close his eyes again, lying there until morning with her. I had turned that over many times in those days before the new moon, and I kept arriving at the same place. What would I see? My imagination, unhelpfully, began to audition candidates. My father had died when I was 27, a heart attack at 59, which everyone described as sudden, and which I had not found surprising because he had spent 40 years eating badly and sleeping badly and working too much, and I had been watching the accumulation of those habits from a close distance since childhood with a mixture of love and low-grade dread. He had been a large, warm, physically undemonstrative man who expressed love through action, fixing things, showing up, driving long distances without complaint. And I had been more like him than I'd admitted for most of my 20s, inheriting the work habits and the sleeping badly and the emotional compression without inheriting the warmth, which I was still working on. I thought, if it shows me my father, what will he look like? The way he was before I grew up and started to understand him, before I got old enough to stop seeing him as large and certain and started seeing the actual person, the worried and tired and privately struggling person underneath, or later. The last few years when he'd slowed down and become softer in ways I hadn't expected. Not diminished, just different, mellowed, easier. Which father would the house choose? I went to bed at 9:30 on new moon night. It was the earliest I'd gone to bed since I was maybe 11 years old and had the flu, and it felt slightly absurd, lying in the dark with the curtains drawn, the clock on the nightstand saying 9:47. I had taken the sedative 30 minutes earlier, a low-dose one I'd used occasionally for years when the insomnia was bad. I waited for the edges to soften. I thought about the naturalist in the boreal forest. I thought about the crow in the snow. I thought about my sister reading 3 pages about Marte, and probably finding it somewhat alarming that her brother had gone from teaching chemistry in the city to writing about a cat from someone else's house, but also probably smiling at it. I thought about soup. I was asleep before 10:30, and I woke at 4:02. The 3rd week. The new moon was in 2 days, and I was, despite my best intentions, thinking about it. Aldrich had called again on schedule, and during this call he was more talkative than the first. He asked if I'd found the bookshelves useful, and we talked briefly about natural history, which was apparently a shared interest, and I asked him, carefully, whether anyone had ever broken Rule 7, had gotten up to investigate on the new moon night. "My nephew," he said. "That's why he left." I waited. "He was fine," Aldrich said. "Nothing happened to him physically, but he was not the same afterward. He's fine now. Years later, he's a normal person with a family and a job. But he does not talk to me because I think I remind him of that week." "What did he see?" Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "He didn't tell me specifically. He said there was someone standing at the foot of his bed. He said it looked like his mother, who died when he was 11. He was 34 at the time. He said she looked the way he remembered her from when he was small, not how she looked when she was sick. He said she didn't speak, but she was, his word, expectant. Like she was waiting for him to do something that he didn't know how to do. And he couldn't close his eyes again, so he lay there until morning." I absorbed this. "He was a sensitive young man," Aldrich said, which didn't sound like a compliment or a criticism, just an observation. "Some people are more receptive to the house. It's nothing to be afraid of, as long as you follow the rules." "What is the house receptive to?" I asked. Another pause. "I bought this property 30 years ago," he said. "The previous owner, an old woman named Irina, told me then what she had been told by the owner before her. The property has been inhabited continuously since roughly 1890. Always someone living in it. Irina told me, some places accumulate. Like how water follows the same path downhill over and over until it carves a groove in the rock. This house has had a lot of living in it. A lot of the particular weight of human lives. It remembers that weight." "That's not an explanation," I said. "No," he said. "It's not. But it's the best I have. I've lived here for 30 years and I don't have a better one." He was quiet for a moment. I heard him breathe out slowly, the measured exhalation of someone choosing their next words. "Irina told me," he said, "that the mistake most people make with old places is assuming that what they don't understand must be against them. Humans tend to read unfamiliarity as threat. It's instinctive, understandable, but it's not always accurate." He paused. "The house is not against you. Whatever is in the house, whatever moves through it, is not against you. It was there before you, and it will be there after you, and it simply needs to be navigated, the way you navigate any space that doesn't belong entirely to you." I went to bed 2 hours earlier than usual on New Moon night, following his instruction, and I took one of the mild sleep aids I'd brought for insomnia. And I slept. I slept deeply and dreamlessly. Or if I dreamed, I don't remember the dreams, until 4 in the morning, when I woke abruptly in the way you sometimes do, no gradual surfacing, but an instantaneous return to consciousness, like a switch. The room was dark. The digital clock on the nightstand said 4:02 a.m. in red numbers. There was something in the hallway. I knew this in the way you know things in the dark without seeing them. Some frequency of presence that the human animal can apparently still detect. Whatever vestigial machinery we have left over from when knowing that something was outside the cave was the difference between waking up and not waking up. There was a presence in the hallway the other side of the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. I did not get up. I stared at the dark gap between the door and its frame. I could see nothing. The house was making its small sounds, the tick of the radiator, distant and steady. But there was also something else. Not a sound exactly. A quality of the air in the room. Pressure maybe, in the way a room feels different when someone else is in it. The way you know without looking that another person has entered. I breathed. I kept my eyes on the gap in the door. I did not get up. For what felt like a long time. 15 minutes? 20? I genuinely don't know. I lay there and breathed and watched the gap. And then, very slowly, the quality in the air changed back to what it was before I woke up. And I was alone in the room again, in the simple, ordinary sense of alone. Just me and the walls and the clock saying 4:22 a.m. in red numbers. I did not get up. Eventually, I fell asleep again. In the morning, Marte was sitting outside the bedroom door in the hallway, washing her face, which she had never done before. She slept downstairs usually. She looked at me when I came out and then looked at the hallway floor for a moment and then back at me, as if confirming something. I reached down, and she didn't pull away when I scratched behind her notched ear, which was the first time she'd allowed that. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the garden, which was frosted over in the early morning light, each dead stem of each dead plant outlined in white, and I thought, all right. And then I drank my coffee and I was fine. Carell came that week to fix the gap in the laundry room window. He was a short, thick-chested man in his early 50s with the efficient, unhurried manner of someone who fixes things for a living and has long since stopped being surprised by what needs fixing. He drove a white pickup truck that had been at some earlier point in its life either a commercial vehicle or owned by someone who treated it like one, because it was dented in very practical places and the bed was organized with the specificity of someone who knows exactly where everything needs to be. He came in through the back, which I opened for him, and he looked around the kitchen with a brief professional survey before saying, "Laundry room?" I showed him and he spent 20 minutes resealing the window frame with something from a caulk gun and didn't say much during it. I made a second cup of coffee and offered him one and he accepted it, black, and drank it standing at the kitchen counter, with the solid practicality of a man who drinks coffee to function rather than to enjoy. "You're Voss's house sitter," he said. It was an observation, not a question. "Yes." "How long?" "Started 4 weeks ago. 2 more to go." He nodded and drained the coffee. He looked around the kitchen again, at the ceiling, at the corners, the way contractors look at spaces, cataloging, assessing, running some private calculation. "Furnace giving you any trouble?" "Not so far." He nodded again. "Call me if it does, not him, me. He'll try to tell you to wait, or he'll try to talk you through it over the phone, and the furnace in this house is not a phone conversation. It needs hands." He said this without criticism, just fact. I asked, carefully, how long he'd been doing work on the property. "Since before Voss," he said. "Irina hired me for the first job, when I was 22, repointing the chimney. I've done every repair on this house since then, 30 years, give or take." I thought about that for a moment. "Did Irina ever mention anything unusual about the property?" Carell looked at me. His face was the kind of face that doesn't change much to register anything. Not surprise, not amusement, not wariness. "Unusual," he said, as if testing the word. "Never mind," I said. He put his cup down on the counter, rinsed it under the tap, a man who cleaned up after himself, notable, and picked up his caulk gun. "I've been in every room in this house," he said, moving toward the back door. "Every room except the study and the basement. In 30 years, I've never had reason to go in those rooms, and Irina never offered, and Voss has never offered, and I've never asked." He paused at the door. "I figure a man who does good work minds his business, and minds his business." He said the last part with a slight emphasis that I understood was directed at me. "Yes," I said. "That's sensible." He gave a brief nod and went out, and I heard his truck start and crunch back down the gravel driveway, and the house settled back into its quiet. I want to be precise about the timing because I have gone over it many times, and it's important to me that this is not something I experienced in the ambiguous dark of 3 in the morning. It was 2:17 p.m. I know because I was sitting at the kitchen table eating a late lunch, watching the clock out of pure habit. I had grown comfortable with the house by then. 4 weeks in, the rooms had developed the comfortable familiarity of a body's own textures. I knew which floorboard creaked where. I knew the particular sound the wind made through the gap in the laundry room window that Carell had said he'd come fix and hadn't. Yet, I knew the rhythms and noises the furnace made as it cycled. The house's vocabulary was legible to me by then, which is why the knocking was unmistakable. Not as something I might have interpreted another way. Not a pipe, not a shift in the walls. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the inside of the basement door. Knock, knock, knock. Each one distinct, each one separated by maybe 3 seconds. Like someone making certain they could be heard. Like someone who had learned to be patient. I did not move for a moment. I sat there with my fork midway between my plate and my mouth, and I listened to the quiet that followed the knocking. The furnace ticked. The gap in the laundry room window sighed. Marthe, who had been on the couch in the next room, appeared in the kitchen doorway and sat there looking at the basement door. I looked at the basement door. The padlock was closed, had not been opened. Still solid, still locked, as it had been every morning when I checked it, which I had started doing, checking it, sometime in the second week, out of a habit I couldn't quite explain to myself. I set my fork down. I got up and walked, not quickly, deliberately, out of the kitchen, through the main room, and picked up my phone from the couch. I went back to the kitchen doorway because I found I did not want to be in a room where I couldn't see the basement door, but also did not want to be closer to it than necessary. I called Aldrich. He answered on the second ring. I remember thinking, even in that moment, that it was notable that he always answered quickly, like he'd been expecting the call. The knocking. I said without preamble. Yes, he said. No surprise in his voice, no alarm either. 3 knocks, slow, from inside. How many times? Just the once? So far, just once. All right, do not go near the door. Do not open the padlock. Go to the main room and stay there. Do you have a book? Something to occupy your mind? Yes. Read it. I'll call you back in an hour. If the knocking comes again before I call, text me. Don't call, and I'll call you immediately. What's in the basement? I asked, with more directness than I'd managed when he'd deflected it the first time. He was quiet for several seconds. Nothing that can get through the padlock, he said. I want you to hold on to that. It cannot get through the padlock. The padlock has held for 11 years, and it will hold tonight. The rule exists, not because of what might happen, but because I need to know when it's active. It's information I need. Do you understand? Not entirely, I said honestly. That's fair, he said. 1 hour. I went to the main room. I sat on the couch with the worn velvet cushion. Marthe came and sat beside me, which was unusual enough in itself that it helped, somehow. I picked up the book I'd been reading, A Natural History of North American Amphibians, which is the kind of dry and orderly subject that I find calming. The world organized by genus and habitat, and I read. There was no second knock. Aldrich called back 53 minutes later. It won't happen again tonight, he said. Probably not for several days, maybe longer. How do you know? Because I've been watching it for 11 years, he said. It has patterns, like weather. I asked, for the third time, what was in the basement. I figured 3 times was the number that would get me a different answer if a different answer was available. He sighed slightly. Not impatiently. The sigh of someone deciding how much of a thing to share. When I bought this property, he said, Irina, the previous owner, showed me the basement before she handed over the keys. There was something down there. Had been for longer than she'd owned the property, she said. It wasn't, he paused, choosing words carefully. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. It was something I don't have a classification for, which, as a man who has spent his professional life classifying things, I'm a retired taxonomist, I find deeply unsettling, even now. And you've kept it? For 11 years? Irina kept it for 22, the person before her for 30. Before that, the record gets unclear. What Irina told me, and what I believe, is that it doesn't leave. It doesn't want to leave, or can't. I was never sure which. It's contained by the space. The basement is its space. As long as the padlock holds, it stays there. And the knocking? Communication, he said, or something like it. It knows we're here. The knocking is acknowledgement of our presence. I've never been able to determine whether it's aggressive or simply habitual. In 11 years of living here, it has never broken through. I've had the door reinforced twice. Why are you telling me this now and not before I took the job? A pause. Because before you took the job, you might have said no. I let that sit for a moment. I considered being angry about it. I was a little angry about it. And now? I said. Now you know the house, he said. Now you're not afraid in the reflexive way you would have been if I'd told you before. Are you afraid now? I thought about it. No, I said, which surprised me and also was true. Good, he said. That's the right response. Fear would have been wrong. This isn't a place that responds well to fear. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You can leave if you want. I'll pay you for the full 6 weeks regardless. I want you to know that." I looked at Marte sitting beside me on the couch. I looked at the room full of books, the fireplace, the window going dark outside, the frost forming on the garden. I thought about my apartment in the city, the neighbors arguing through the glass, the grocery store cheese section. "I'll stay," I said. In the 5th week, I broke one of the rules. Not deliberately, or not entirely deliberately. I want to be precise about this too, because honesty requires me to admit that a small part of it was deliberate, not the result, but the setup. I had been reading late more often, which Aldrich had cautioned against, and staying up past 11 with the radio on had become something close to a habit. I was not, by the 5th week, afraid of the house in the way I might have been in the first 2 weeks. I had moved into a kind of ease with it that, in retrospect, was probably less earned than it felt. There is a specific kind of carelessness that comes from surviving things. Not recklessness, not contempt for the danger. I still checked the padlock every morning, still latched the north windows at sunset without fail, still left the water on Tuesdays. But a slight loosening of the animal alertness that you operate on when everything is unfamiliar. The house had become familiar. I knew its sounds and its rhythms. I knew which mornings Marte would come down early and which she would sleep in upstairs. I knew the exact time the daylight changed in the main room, when it stopped being morning light and became afternoon light, that particular shift in angle that happened around 2 o'clock in November and December, when the sun is already thinking about leaving. I had become, in a word, comfortable. That was probably the thing Aldrich hadn't warned me about, because he couldn't have, because it wasn't a rule that could be written down. Don't become comfortable. But what does that mean in practice? How do you remain alert to a house you're living in? You can't. You're not built for sustained alertness. Nobody is. It always settles, eventually, into the background. The same way that people who live near train tracks stop hearing the trains within a month. So I was comfortable, and I was reading late, and the room was warm from the radiator, and I noticed the cold and went to check the thermostat and came back and opened the window 2 inches to check the weather stripping, which was, when I am completely honest, a thin pretext. I was curious. I had been curious about the north window rule since I first read it. The rules I didn't understand made me itch in the particular way that unexplained rules always had. Since childhood. Since the first time a teacher said, "Because that's the rule." And I sat there quietly dissatisfied because that's the rule is not a reason, it's a statement about power. 2 inches. I pulled at 2 inches and felt the outside air, and then something looked at me through the gap. It was a Wednesday night and I had been reading late, later than Aldrich had advised, but there was no new moon coming for 3 weeks, and I had felt, if not exactly reckless, then at least like I had earned some latitude. I had the radio on low, the man reading his prose in the background, and around 11:30 I noticed the temperature in the room had dropped noticeably. I thought, the furnace. I had Carell's number. I also had by this point a working understanding of the furnace's rhythm, and I knew the sound it made when it was struggling. I had not heard that sound, but I was cold, and I went to check the thermostat in the hallway, and the thermostat was fine, the furnace was fine, and I came back to the main room and it was still cold. The north side windows. I looked at them. There were 2 of them in the main room, facing north, double-paned old glass, and they were latched, as they should have been. I had latched them at sunset, as I did every night, but there was a draft coming from somewhere, or what felt like a draft, a directional coolness. I walked to the windows and put my hand near the frame, and I unlatched one, just briefly, not to open it fully. I told myself I was just checking the seal, just seeing if the cold was coming from a gap in the weather stripping. I unlatched it and pulled it inward, maybe 2 inches, enough to feel the outside air, which was genuinely cold, well below freezing. And then something looked at me through the gap. I don't know how else to say it. I didn't see a face or a body or anything that I could describe with any specificity. But there was a looking happening, something on the other side of that 2-inch gap directing its attention at me with an intensity that I physically felt, in my sternum, like a low chord on a large instrument. Complete, focused attention. Not hostile, not benign, simply and utterly attentive. I latched the window. My hands were steadier than they should have been, which I think was just shock. I stood with my back against the wall beside the window, not looking at it, staring at the opposite wall for probably a full minute. Marthe was in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room. She was sitting very upright, tail wrapped around her paws, staring not at the window but at me, evaluating. I did not open the window again. I turned off the radio. I went upstairs and went to bed and lay in the dark thinking about what attention feels like when it comes from something you don't have a name for. I didn't sleep for a long time. When I did, I dreamed of nothing, which felt like a gift. In the morning, I called Aldrich and told him what I'd done. He was quiet for so long that I thought the call had dropped. "You felt it looking," he said finally. It was not a question. Yes. Did it try to push through? Open further? No. Just looked. All right, he exhaled. You shouldn't have done that, you know that. I know. The rule is there because what's on the north side of the house after dark is attracted to light and warmth. If the window is open, it can sense the interior. It becomes familiar with you. Familiarity is how it gets a foothold. What does that mean, a foothold? It means the boundary becomes negotiable, he said. When things like that learn the frequency of a person, they can follow it. They tend to go where they're invited, even inadvertently. You need to be careful for the next few weeks, more careful than you've been. I apologized. It was a genuine apology. He accepted it in the measured way he did most things, without excess. Don't do it again, he said. I didn't. The 6th and final week. The last Tuesday, I left the glass of water on the kitchen table, as I had every Tuesday. I had stopped trying to find explanations for the empty glass by the 3rd week. It had just become part of the rhythm of the house, like checking the padlock in the morning, like watching the old man on the road. By the 6th week, it was simply a Tuesday thing that I did, the way people have Tuesday things. Laundry, calls to their mothers, weekly reports at work, leave the water, go to bed, find the glass empty in the morning, note it without elaborating, go on. What I had started to wonder, in the 5th and 6th weeks, was whether the rituals of the house were doing something. Not in a supernatural sense, or not only in a supernatural sense. I was still a high school science teacher in my foundational orientation toward the world, and I held that somewhat stubbornly, but in the simpler sense that rituals do things to people. They structure time. They give you a set of obligations that are external and clear, removed from the murky internal negotiation of mood and motivation that makes ordinary life so exhausting. Every day in that house, I woke up and I had things to do. Check the padlock, feed Marthe morning and evening, close the north windows by sunset, leave the water on Tuesdays. The obligations were small and odd, but they were real. And meeting them every day gave the days a backbone they often lack. I've lived alone in my apartment for 4 years, and I have no animals and no rituals beyond the accidental ones. The coffee at the same time every morning, the same walk to the library on Tuesdays. And I have the insomnia and the low-grade anxiety and the sense of days sliding past without distinction. I am not drawing a conclusion. I'm just noting the contrast. I thought about this while I did the last Tuesday water, standing at the kitchen table, placing the half-full glass carefully in the center with the slight self-consciousness of someone performing a ritual they didn't invent and don't fully understand. Marthe watched me from the couch. The house was quiet in its nighttime way. I turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. In the morning, the glass was empty, as it had been every week. I washed it, I made coffee. I stood at the window and the garden was there in its dormant state, patient, waiting for a spring that was still months away. I drove into town that day for the last grocery run, to restock things I'd used. The town was small. A gas station, a hardware store, a diner, a grocery store with 3 aisles, and a woman at the register who had been there every time I'd come in and who knew by the 4th week that I was staying at the Voss property, and treated this information with the respectful curiosity of someone who has learned not to ask questions about certain things. She was efficient and friendly and once gave me an extra bag without being asked when she could see my hands were full. I liked her. I bought coffee and bread and a bottle of wine, because the last week seemed like a week that deserved a bottle of wine, and a piece of good cheese because I was no longer doing that particular grocery store calculation. I had been paid, and the money was sitting in an envelope in the refrigerator, and the cheese was not unreasonable. That evening, I opened the wine and sat in the main room with the fire going. I'd gotten competent with the fireplace by week 3. The particular angle of the grate and the kind of wood in the pile beside the back door and the amount of time to let the kindling go before adding a log. And I read the last 100 pages of the naturalist's book. He had survived his years in the boreal forest and come home and found home different than he'd left it, which is the thing that always happens. You change while you're away in an intense place, and the ordinary place has not changed, so you walk back into it slightly misaligned. And the misalignment takes time to smooth out. Sometimes it doesn't fully smooth out. I read the last page and closed the book and sat looking at the fire. Speaking of the man on the road, on the Thursday of the final week, 5 days before I was due to leave, he did something he had not done in the previous 5 weeks. He turned in at the end of the gravel driveway, not all the way up to the house. He stopped maybe 20 feet in, just past the mailbox. He stood there, the way he always stood, with that quality of complete stillness even in motion. And then he raised one hand. Not a wave. Not quite. More like an acknowledgement. Like the way you might raise your hand at someone across a room that you knew but didn't need to speak to. A small lift of the hand, and then it came back down and he turned and walked away down the road as he always did. I stood at the window with the lights low and watched him go. I told Aldrich about it on our last call, the following Sunday, 2 days before my departure. He raised his hand. Aldrich said slowly, "Yes." There was a long pause. "That's new," he said. "What does it mean?" "I'm not certain. He's been walking that road since before I bought the property. Irina told me about him too. She said he always walked at the same time, always stopped, always looked. In 30 years, she had never seen him do anything beyond that. He's not a danger. I've always been sure of that. The rule exists because I didn't know what he was, and with things you don't understand, distance is sensible. He's not a person," I said, "not a question." Another long pause. "I don't know what he is," Aldrich said. "He looks like one." He has looked like the same elderly person for 32 years of me watching him, and 22 before that of Irina watching him, and however long before her. He doesn't change. He's been wearing the same coat, I believe, for 32 years, but I've never spoken to him. I've never been close enough to say with certainty what he is. He raised his hand at me, I said, like he knew I was leaving soon. "Yes," Aldrich said quietly. "I thought the same thing. My last night in the house, I couldn't sleep, not out of fear. It was a different feeling, something like the particular insomnia of the last night of a vacation, when you're already half returned to your ordinary life, and the place you're leaving is already becoming memory, slightly unreal, and you want to hold it a moment longer in its current actual form. I had packed most of my things in the afternoon. It didn't take long. I'd brought less than I'd thought I would need and discovered, as you do in those situations, that less turns out to be sufficient, that the abundance we surround ourselves with at home is largely habit and comfort rather than necessity. The 2 bags I'd brought sat by the bedroom door, neatly zipped, and looking at them made the room feel already vacated, already transitioning back into the guest room it was between occupants. I had put the house back to rights over the past 2 days, not because it was particularly in disorder. I'd kept it reasonably neat throughout, but because it seemed right to leave it the way I'd found it as a mark of respect, the way you make your bed at a hotel, even though you know someone will strip it the moment you leave. Not for practicality, for the gesture. I had replaced the books I'd taken from the shelves, noting their positions carefully and returning them as close to their original places as I could determine. I'd done a thorough cleaning on Saturday, more thorough than was probably necessary. Every surface of the kitchen, the bathroom, the main room. I'd checked the windows, all of them, north and south and east and west, checking the latches and the sills and the weather stripping. Carell had caulked the laundry room window properly and it was sealed now. No more draft from that corner. I'd checked the padlock last thing on Saturday night and first thing Sunday morning, both times intact, both times solid. Both times offering nothing beyond its own continued existence, as the thing standing between the basement and the kitchen. I thanked it silently. The way you thank inanimate objects that have done their job without complaint. 30 years of reliability deserves at least a private acknowledgement. I went downstairs at midnight. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, just the low light over the stove, and I sat with the house. Marte came and sat on the table itself, which she had never done before, and she put her face close to mine and looked at me for a long time with those amber eyes that held, as cat eyes always seem to, some exhausted private wisdom. "I know," I said to her, "which is what you say to cats when you have nothing more articulate." I did not turn on the radio. I did not go near the north windows. I listened to the house make its nighttime sounds. The radiator, the wind, the particular creak of the third stair that I had stopped jumping at 6 weeks ago, and I thought about the kind of weight that accumulates in a place. The kind of grooves that are worn into stone by water following the same path. I thought about Irina, and the person before her and whoever before that, all the way back to 1890. The glass of water left every Tuesday. The window latched at sunset. The padlock checked in the morning. The old man on the road, walking and stopping and watching and walking on, for longer than any of us had been alive. I thought about the thing in the basement, whatever it was, going quiet again after its 3 knocks, returning to patience. 11 years of Aldrich's patience in response. An arrangement of mutual forbearance. I thought about the new moon night, and the presence in the hallway outside my door, and the way Marte had been sitting there in the morning, washing her face, as if she had kept watch. I thought about Aldrich on the phone saying, "This is a place that does not respond well to fear." I thought about the thing at the north window looking at me with that complete, soundless attention. I thought about how I had stood with my back against the wall afterward, and how Marte had evaluated me, and how, ultimately, I had been all right. I had been, somehow, all right. My tea went cold while I sat there. The clock on the microwave said 2:07 a.m. I rinsed the cup and set it in the rack to dry, and went upstairs and got into the bed for the last time and looked at the ceiling, and at some point I fell asleep. Aldrich arrived the following day at 2 in the afternoon, which was earlier than I'd expected. The dark green Volvo came around the bend in the driveway and he got out, and he was dressed the same as when I'd first met him. Gray wool cardigan, soft indoor shoes, except that he was wearing a hat against the cold. A plain one, dark, nothing remarkable. He looked at the house for a moment before he looked at me. Just a quick scan, the way you check on something you've left in someone else's care. Looking for obvious damage, I suppose, finding none. "You stayed," he said, which is a thing you'd only say to someone who surprised you a little by staying. I did. He gave me a nod that contained something I'd call respect, though he was not a warm man in the conventional sense, and respect from him was drier and more specific than the ordinary kind. We walked through the house together. He checked the windows, the padlock, the furnace. He found the house as I'd left it. Everything in its place. Books back on the right shelves, dishes clean, the garden still dormant but unmolested. Marte appeared and went directly to him, winding around his legs with the urgency of genuine affection, which she had not once offered me in 6 weeks. "She likes you," I said. "She tolerates me," he said, which was probably true. He moved through the house with the practiced unhurriedness of someone who had walked these rooms 10,000 times and knew them the way you know the shape of your own hands. He ran his hand along the windowsills on the north side, not checking anything I could identify, just touching them, the way you touch things that are yours and that you've been away from. He stopped at the writing desk and straightened the stone that weighted down his papers, which I had moved slightly during my 6 weeks and replaced imperfectly. He didn't say anything about it, he just put it back. At the basement door, he stood for a moment with his hand on the padlock, feeling the weight of it, reading it through his palm. He did not open it. He did not look at me. He simply stood there for a few seconds, and then he released the padlock and continued on. In the kitchen, he went to the table and put his hands flat on it. He stood like that for a moment, looking at the center of the table where the glass had been every Tuesday. "You left it every week," he said. "Every week." He nodded slowly, looking at the table. Something in his face was difficult to read. Not emotion, exactly. Or not an emotion I had a name for. Something in the register of acknowledgement or gratitude. Or maybe just the satisfaction of knowing that the thing he'd asked to be done had been done. "Good," he said finally, and took his hands off the table. I had made up the envelope before he arrived. The return of his car key, the house key, the handyman's number, the list of things that had happened, the knocking on the basement door, the open window, the man on the road raising his hand. Written out factually, nothing embellished. A report. He read it, standing in the kitchen while I sat at the table with a cup of coffee. He read carefully, without expression, the way a doctor reads a chart. He asked no questions about the window. He asked no questions about the knocking. When he got to the part about the man raising his hand, he read it twice. He raised his hand. He said again, quietly, like he was testing the sentence. "Yes." He folded the paper and put it in the pocket of his cardigan. He went to the refrigerator and took out the envelope with my pay and cash, which he'd left there before he departed. He put it on the table in front of me. "Thank you," he said. We sat for a while longer than was strictly necessary. He made tea this time without asking, the same as he had on the first day, and we sat at the kitchen table and he asked about my sister, which surprised me. I'd mentioned her during one of our weekly calls, just in passing. He had remembered. He was that kind of listener. He asked if I'd gone back to teaching, and I told him about the community college position, and he said the students would be lucky, which was such an unguarded thing to say, so unlike his usual measured register, that I think he surprised himself with it. "The previous house sitter," I said, "the school teacher, her note said, everything was fine, I followed the rules, do the same." "Yes." "That's not everything that happened, is it? She just didn't write it all down." He looked at me with those pale gray eyes for a moment. The afternoon light from the kitchen window was behind him, making his white hair slightly bright at the edges. "Probably not," he said. I picked up my bag. Marte was sitting on the couch, watching me with her usual flat evaluation. I had bought her a small toy, one of those simple ones, just a piece of fleece on a string, which she had completely ignored for 2 days, and then suddenly decided to love at some point in week 4, and I left it on the couch beside her. She looked at it, then at me. "Goodbye, Marte," I said. She blinked once, slowly, which cats do when they consider you trustworthy, and went back to looking at the window. I carried my bag to the Honda, which started on the 3rd try as it always did. The pine trees along the driveway had their branches spread with the slight weight of the cold, dark green and completely still in the December air. I pulled out onto the road. About 200 meters down, I passed the spot where the old man always turned and walked back. There was nothing there. Just the road and the trees on either side and the low, gray sky above them. I drove past it and didn't stop. I have thought since about what to make of 6 weeks in that house. Not constantly. Not the way you think about a trauma which you can't put down. More the way you think about a place you lived in that taught you something without quite teaching it. Where the knowledge came sideways, through the accumulation of small experiences rather than any single revelation. I did not talk to Petra about it, beyond stopping at the reference desk a few weeks later to thank her for the recommendation. She pushed her glasses up with one finger and said, "How was it?" And I said, "Interesting." And she gave me a look that said she already knew it had been interesting, had perhaps known it would be, which is why she'd thought of me. She said good, in a tone that closed the subject, and handed me the book I'd come to return, and that was that. I have not talked about it publicly. Until now, writing this. There are a few complications I keep running into when I try to think about it honestly. The first is that I cannot verify most of it. The half-empty glass every Wednesday morning could have been Marte. The presence in the hallway on New Moon night could have been a half-dream in the soft boundary state of the sedative wearing off. The thing at the north window could have been my own reflected breath in the cold, fogging the glass in a particular way, my brain pattern matching it into something sentient. These are all available explanations. They are all slightly less convincing than they should be, given that I'm an empirical person by training and by preference, but they are available. The second complication is that the experience changed me in ways that I can point to but can't fully account for. I sleep better. I am less anxious in the free-floating, contentless way that characterized most of the year before. I am more patient in a way that I think is genuine, rather than performed. With my students, with the arguing neighbors, with myself. I wrote 3 letters to my sister in 6 weeks in that house, actual pen and paper letters, and she has written back, and we have talked on the phone 4 times since January, which is more than we'd managed in the previous 2 years combined. She asked once if something had happened to make me reach out more, and I said I had some time to think, which was true and also insufficient. The third complication is the simplest. Some things happened that I cannot explain. The 3 knocks from below the kitchen floor, the thing that looked through the 2-inch gap in the north window, the 4th knock, from the ceiling, answering. The man who walked the road for 32 years, wearing the same coat, never aging, raising his hand on the second to last evening as if he knew I was leaving. These things happened. I was present for them, well-rested, sober, in ordinary states of consciousness. They are in the record. I am not sure what I'm supposed to do with that. Given that I'm an empirical person by training, I think I'm supposed to find a framework that contains them. I've been looking for one, and I haven't found one that fits fully, and I've started to suspect that the looking is the wrong response. That Aldrich Voss, in 32 years of living in that house, and Irina before him in 22, and whoever before her, had all arrived at the same place. Not understanding exactly, but accommodation. An arrangement. The water on Tuesdays. The padlock in the mornings. The window at sunset. Not comprehension. Just respect for what's there. I'm not sure I was built for that. I'm a person who asks why. But I'm working on it. There are a few things I know with some certainty. The house has been inhabited continuously since approximately 1890. Something in it has been there longer than that. It does not leave. It has not left. It has, as far as anyone alive can testify, remained in its arrangement with the humans who live there, the way very old arrangements tend to persist. Not because anyone particularly wants them to, but because nobody has found a better alternative. The old man on the road is not a man. Or not only a man. He has walked that road for longer than anyone has kept track of, in the same coat, at the same time. He raised his hand at me on my second to last evening. I have decided to take that as goodbye. I have also decided, less certainly, that the goodbye meant he recognized the end of something. That my 6 weeks registered with him as a thing with a shape, a beginning and an end, in the way that time tends not to have a shape when you've been walking the same road since before anyone living was born. The thing at the north window is not something I want to encounter again, but I understand now why it's there. Things are attracted to warmth and light. The house is full of warmth and light, always has been. 130 years of people cooking and reading and worrying and loving and making small ordinary sounds in the dark. Of course things gather at the edge of it. Of course you keep the window latched. The basement. I've thought about the basement a great deal. I've thought about Aldrich's word, communication. 3 slow knocks, evenly spaced, patient. Something that has learned patience from 11 years of a locked door, and 30 years before that, and 30 more before that. Something that knocks and waits and knocks again when the right time comes. I think this is only my interpretation. I have no special knowledge. I think the knocking is not a demand. I think it's the same as the glass of water on the table, which is empty in the morning. An acknowledgement exchanged between things that share a space and have agreed, without ever quite talking about it, to share it peacefully. The water, though, that one I've never settled. The half glass, empty in the morning, every Tuesday. It's the one rule whose purpose was never explained. Aldrich never told me why, and I never asked directly. Maybe I should have. Maybe it's the most important one. Maybe it's just a cat. I've stopped needing to resolve it. That's the other thing I learned in that house. Some questions stay open not because the answers are hidden, but because openness is what they require. A closed answer is a door latched. Some things you leave the door slightly ajar. Not the north window. That one you latch. I took a different job in January, back in the city. A position at a community college that pays less than I'd like, but is steady. I've been back in my apartment with the arguing neighbors and the grocery store cheese section and the insomnia that the doctor calls anxiety and I call memory. Except, as I said, the insomnia has been better. I don't know why. I have a working theory, which I can't prove, that 6 weeks of being genuinely, specifically afraid, in a contained and structured way, of knowing the rules, of following them, of lying awake at 4 in the morning listening to a presence in the hallway and breathing through it and not running, did something that the usual formless anxiety of ordinary life doesn't. Fear of a specific thing, well handled, might be its own kind of remedy. That's not a medical opinion, that's just a guess. Aldrich emailed me in February. A short email, plain, no pleasantries. It said, "The man on the road has not appeared since you left. I wanted you to know. AV." I read it 3 times. I'm not sure what to do with it. I wrote back, "Thank you for telling me. I hope the house is well. Tell Marte I said hello." He didn't reply, which felt right. There's one more thing. I've been not writing it, moving around it this whole time, and I should just write it. The night before I left, sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with my cold tea, I heard, from below, through the floor, through the kitchen tiles and the joists, and the door with the padlock, 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. The same as before. Patient, even, deliberate. Each one separated by about 3 seconds. And then, after a short silence, I heard, or I believe I heard, I cannot be completely certain, a 4th knock that I did not make, coming from above, from the ceiling, from the floorboards of the room above the kitchen, which was the empty 2nd bedroom, the one I had not used. Slow, deliberate, once, as if something was answering. I sat very still. Marte was on the table with her amber eyes open and calm, not afraid, just watchful, in the way she was watchful about everything. She glanced at the ceiling and then glanced at the floor and then looked at me. She blinked once, slowly. "You are trustworthy." I finished my tea. I rinsed the cup. I went upstairs to bed. In the morning, I drove back to the city in the Honda that started on the 3rd try, through the corridor of pine trees, past the empty spot on the road where the old man turned and walked, and I was fine. And I am fine. And I keep the window latched at night in my apartment too, even though there are no rules here requiring it, just out of habit, just because it seems like the sensible thing to do. You don't always need a reason. Sometimes the reason is just, someone who has been paying attention for 30 years told you to. That's enough.